Hardhat's all about showing up to play hard, doing what it takes to win.
If you want to cement legacy, win another.
He's your third center.
You don't want to pump him up too much, but it's hard not to.
This is maybe the most I've ever agreed with you.
Hey, Buddy Manning here. Welcome to a midweek edition of the Garden Report. And we have with us here today Brian Lewis from the New York Post, covering the Nets, who stand to be one of the more interesting offseason teams here, especially for the Celtics purposes, as they and some other teams look to move money this offseason. The Nets are pretty much in full control, Brian. 70 million-ish in cap space potentially here for them. You know, after they sign a couple guys, maybe 40, 50 to take on some contracts, make some moves. Obviously, they're going to have a heavy hand in the draft with 4 first-round picks coming up this week or later this month. So wanted to check in with you. I know you wrote about it today in the Post as well, that the Nets just have a lot of power this offseason as they try to continue this rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't call them, kings of the NBA, considering what their roster looks like, but maybe the kingmakers. They'll certainly have a lot of say in other people's trades. And, a lot of the roads run through Brooklyn, but I mean, Sean Marks, the GM of the Nets, he'll be the one collecting the tolls when other people are looking to avoid the second apron, looking to complete 3 or 4 team trades, or in some cases, maybe just looking to dump salary in a direct fashion. He might have a hand in all of those sort of things.
Yeah, so I'll start with their money situation here. They got some free agents, Cam Thomas, chief among them. That's obviously a guy I'd imagine they want to keep there and will probably command a significant salary after the scoring seasons he's shown or scoring spurts he's shown over the last couple of years here. Daron Sharp, another guy who's looked good there at times, a couple others that maybe they want to keep in the mix there. And then, of course, Nick Claxton, a guy that maybe could attract some trade interest this summer. So how much do you anticipate the Nets ultimately having to take on contracts here and do some of the other stuff once all those deals are finished with?
Oh, I mean, you're saying how much do I expect them to have in cap room, or you're asking me, do I expect that they'll be taking on salary dumps?
How much in cap room do you think they, give or take, will have
Probably
to work
50.
with once a lot of this work's done?
Well, probably 50. I mean, yes, some of their own free agents happen to be restricted.
Mm-hmm.
So when you sequence those deals, presumably, even if they come to an agreement with Cam Thomas and come to an agreement with Daron Sharp, you would presume that those guys officially get done last, that you're exhausting your cap space for the purpose of leveraging other deals, and then they'll loop back around. So practically, I would expect 50 million or so in that vicinity, maybe a little more, maybe a little less.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. When I took a look there, Thomas maybe makes like 20 million a year when that deal gets done, something like that. Sharp, who knows? But when you look at the teams that could make a deal with the Nets here, you start to think about the Celtics because they're obviously, I think, one of the more publicized teams trying to move off some money here this offseason. They have a guy in Porzingis who could move into that cap space there for 30 million 1 year. Obviously, Holiday with 3 years would be trickier, I think, moving into Brooklyn's cap space there because it's just such a long-term deal. But I think there's potential for a deal here between these two teams. Now, what I'm curious about when the Nets are probably listening to pretty much everybody around the league about taking on some money, what are they going to want here? Like, what do you think is going to be the biggest motivator? Are they going to want guys that they could flip to other teams for more draft capital? Is it going to be about bringing in the best draft capital that they possibly could with this money coming in to their team here? Like, what do you think is going to motivate them most when they're assessing players that they could potentially take on?
I think it probably depends on who they're taking back.
Mm-hmm.
And what is available to pluck off of somebody else's roster, right? So in some cases, if they see a young talent that they think that they can pluck off of somebody's roster as the sweetener, I'm sure they would gladly do that. I think by and large, and again, I'm talking in general terms, by and large, I think it would be draft capital. Now, however, they do have 4 first-round picks this year and 5 in the top 36. So in a perfect world, maybe future draft capital, next year's draft is supposed to be every bit as deep as this year's draft, and they only have 1 first-round pick in next year's draft. So in a perfect world, I think, future draft capital would be something they'd be looking at. But like I said, if somebody doesn't have the draft capital that they're looking for, but they happen to have young, controllable talent that they think could be part of their rebuild long term, or a player that has value throughout the league that they can flip, then I'm sure they would be interested in that too. Sean marks the gym there. He doesn't mind doing complicated. That's not a problem for him. So he doesn't always have to do things in the most direct route.
Yeah, and roster spot's important there too in that sense. And, as I look at the roster here, right now, 9 guys under contract, but 4 team options, a non-guaranteed and Maxwell Lewis. It could open up a lot of roster space here. And as we've mentioned, a ton of cap space potentially here. Claxton, obviously $25 million this upcoming season. Cam Johnson, I've been reading some tweets and just rumors out there that, maybe they'll float him to try to move up in the draft here. That's obviously a guy that I think they've listened to at different points here since he's come over in the Kevin Durant trade. And then obviously a few young guys who have shown some strides, Noah Clowney, Derek Whitehead, a couple of those other guys, potentially they want to keep around there. But what do you think this roster looks like next season for them? Like, are there, we've mentioned Cam Thomas, some of the other guys in the mix here. Like, could this be a total shakeup for them this summer? And this just looks completely different than it does right now? Or are there still going to be some players, some pieces here that they want moving forward into the future?
Simply put, yes to the first question. I do fully expect the roster to look significantly different come opening night. Now, that doesn't mean that there will be no players back.
Yep.
I won't say it's a blank slate, but I'd say there's a lot of painting left to do to fill in this picture. There will be a number of new faces. I do think they value Cam Thomas. I do think they would like to retain him on a number that they like. I'm not sure that they're going to bid against themselves to do it. And frankly, there aren't that many other teams that have money. Certainly, Cam Thomas's best opportunity at a huge contract would probably have to come in a sign and trade. And you know that those are more difficult sometimes than people think they are. So I certainly think they would like to have him back, and he has expressed interest in coming back. Day'Ron Sharpe, I would be almost stunned if he weren't back at a lower number, because we've seen the nature of the NBA and we've seen how big men get paid. So probably at a somewhat lower number. If I had to take a wild guess, 10 million a year ish, maybe for Day'Ron, maybe a little more. Whereas Cam might be closer to double that. But I would fully expect both of them to be back. Again, unless Cam ends up getting moved in a larger deal. Zaire. Now, Zaire Williams, that's a different story. He has a particularly high cap hold. So I'm not sure that he ends up getting a qualifying offer. But he was very happy here. He definitely would like to come back. My suspicion is that they'll work something out at a lower number than his qualifying, which offhand I think might be like 8.3 million or something like that, 8.5 million. That's pretty heavy, but I would expect to see him back at some number below the qualifying. So that, I mean, it's not like there will be no players back.
Could D'Angelo Russell be back in the mix?
Definitely, I could see that. It probably would depend on how their salary dump endeavors go. They will need grown-ups in the room because they are going to be very young and very inexperienced. And while I know a number of the fans are quite adamant about tanking and losing as many games as possible, which is, I think, the direction they're going to go, if you want to develop young players, you kind of need a point guard. It is kind of incumbent upon you to be able to run some sort of offense, or else they're harder to develop. So I definitely could see him coming back. I think it would be on a significant pay cut. And I think it would have to wait until we see exactly what they've managed to do in terms of taking salary dumps. But it's certainly something that I could see happening.
I want to get to some Celtics possibilities here as well, because I do think there's probably some chance that these two teams get together, whether it's directly in a deal this offseason or in a larger deal. And I think a lot of the trades this offseason are probably going to be bigger deals, especially ones involving Brooklyn. For some of the stars that are moving or just multiple trades coming together. We saw a lot of that at the trade deadline as well. So we'll get to that in just a second here. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Prizepicks, as the championship series continues here. No better time to go over to Prizepicks and add to your daily fantasy team here. And they've made daily fantasy sports accessible and always running great free squares. And this one coming up for the next game here on Wednesday, Jalen Williams, more than 0.5 points, a free square. Then that can be one out of your two squares for your team here on Prizepicks. All Jalen Williams needs to do is to score 1 point to cash that pick. So go over there and get that before tip-off ahead of game 3 in Indianapolis. That's a free Jalen Williams square right now over on Prizepicks. And Prizepicks, you know the deal. It's the best place to go and get daily fantasy sports right now by picking 2 or more players and more or less on their stat projections to win up to 2,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prizepicks. There's only one series left in the playoffs, and the championship is officially on the line. That means time is running out to put your final takes to the test on Prizepicks. Available many states right now, as well as 2,000 times your cash when you pick more or less on player stats, points, rebounds, assists, and more right now over there. Join millions of users and sign up today and use the code CLNS to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. All kinds of great weekly promotions that lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday, each Tuesday with discounted player projections up to 25%, and Flex Friday, where you can opt in and be eligible for the protected play. Choose squares from any game on the board, and if your lineup does not win, you get your net losses back in promo funds on Flex Friday. So again, use that code CLNS, play $5, get $50 instantly. Prizepicks, run your game. So Celtics Nets here, Brian. Could something come together between these two teams? I mean, there's a bunch of possibilities. Obviously, Porzingis could go right into the cap space and eat up most of that. That's tough for me to imagine because I'd have to think the Nets would want pretty significant compensation to eat up that much of their cap space, just dumping Porzingis right into it. Now, could he play for a little bit of the season, rekindle some of his value, and then the Nets move him again? I guess that's possibly enticing if there's no better option for Brooklyn out there for some of that money, but I have a hard time imagining that one. And then with Jrue Holiday, even though, again, fits into that cap space, I see almost no way he ends up there, given that, there's some reporting out there that teams might actually want draft picks attached to take on him. So 3-year deal. Can't imagine that one. Is there anything else I'm not thinking of here?
I would be and I'm not. I understand. You did your promo. I'm not a betting man, so I don't know much about odds and so forth. I would think the odds of Jrue Holiday ending up in Brooklyn, other than coming in as a visitor, or pretty damn slim.
Yeah.
I would defer to you in terms of gauging his value and what they could acquire around the league for him. I mean, he's still He's a great defender, he's a winning player, etc. But he does not in any way remotely fit Brooklyn's timeline, and you would have him for some time, unless the idea is to reroute him somewhere else. I don't see the Nets being in the business of doing either of those things. Porzingis is a different story altogether. I definitely could see them doing Porzingis depending on what the sweetener is. And as we discussed, yes, Boston has 28 and 32, I think, this year. The Nets are rife with picks this year.
Mm-hmm.
They have more picks than they're going to have opportunities to develop rookies next year. They probably, as it is, need to consolidate their picks to some extent. But as far as future draft compensation, I certainly could see that. I'm certain they would want to wrangle significant compensation because $30 million is not an insignificant sum. I understand it's an expiring contract. And I understand that hopefully he regains full health and maybe can regain some of his value. But either way, as I believe Bobby Marks on ESPN did point out, a former Nets assistant GM, by the way, they would need to be incentivized appropriately. What exactly that price is, I'm not sure. Boston's first next year, I believe, is tradable.
Yep, I believe so.
What exactly the cost would be, I don't know, but I'm sure it would be reasonably heavy.
So looking at some of the Boston picks here, obviously you mentioned 28-32. Next year's is tradable, couple second-round picks. 2027, I believe, would be tradable as well, depending on how they sequence that there. And then, of course, the Spurs own their right from the swap rights from the Derek White trade. And then I believe they traded 29 to Portland for Jrue Holiday. So that frees up 2030 as a swap. 2031, I believe, is available. And then I want to say 2032 is frozen from the second apron hits. So there's some draft capital to go out here from Boston. There's a 1 first to move Porzingis to Brooklyn. Maybe you think about that, but my inclination has been if you're going to move off a first and they don't have a ton of them going into the future and they're going to need them, to keep this roster sustainable around Brown and Tatum, if you're going to build around those two, wouldn't be the worst idea to hold on to Porzingis, at least to start the year. But the problem is Brooklyn's going to go and use that cap space before the season starts, I'd imagine, almost in full. And then once they're out of the mix here, there's really no cap space left around the league. So like we've talked about, that's the advantage Brooklyn has in some of these negotiations is they're the only team with money.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, teams that aren't doing business with Brooklyn could try to form 4-team deals,
Yep.
and just spread the money and scatter it that way. But in terms of dumping large contracts, not, chiseling off 7 or 8 or 10 million, but when you're talking about trying to get off $30 million, there's really nobody else to do business with. That's where the Nets will have a certain amount of leverage. And to answer your other question, yes, I would be beyond moderately surprised. I'd be stunned if they haven't used the lion's share of their cap space. If not by draft night, then certainly well before opening night. That is, right now, their biggest asset. Well, they have a ton of future picks. I think they have 31 future picks, 15 first and 16 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
But they're going to be adding to that core of picks by using this cap space. And frankly, also by eventually, I would imagine, divesting themselves of Cam Johnson and maybe Nick Claxton as well.
Yeah, so that's almost two main picks to use at a certain point. But, once you're in that rebuild mode, you pile them up and maybe utilize them to pick up a star down the line. we'll see what happens with this Giannis thing. It doesn't sound like he's going to move this offseason, so maybe that ends up working better in Brooklyn's timeline
My
down
suspicion
the
is that
line.
he's not. And
Yeah.
again, I'm going to preface this by saying, his camp has they've kept their head down. I don't know who Alex Saratsas' agent is talking to. I don't know. But I had two people who I trust last week tell me that they did not expect him to move, that they did not expect him, meaning Giannis, to, in their words, essentially take a flamethrower to the place to force his way out. And then Giannis himself came out and made comments Monday when he was in Brazil, dedicating a basketball court, about how he was looking forward to making another finals with Milwaukee. So all signs to me are just pointing at him starting the season where he is. Now, I don't know. Things change. But if he's not in Milwaukee at this point, I certainly wouldn't put a lot of money on him being in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it feels like the momentum's against him moving at this point, and that's probably good for Brooklyn. They can do another rebuild season here, and again, if there's more momentum toward them taking a step toward winning next summer, and Giannis decides to make that move, then they might be in a better position to add him at that point. Now, you got to match the contract and all that at that point. Who knows how many significant contracts there are on this roster? That would probably actually point toward them maybe trying to take on some long-term money that they can actually use to match Giannis's contract at that point. So that's got to be a consideration too, I'd imagine, with them. Johnson, could be time to move on from him potentially here if there's a great offer. Claxton, that's a bigger salary that's around for 3 more years. So in my mind, maybe a little more momentum toward a guy like that sticking around. Now, to bring it back to Boston, I looked at this today. Again, Porzingis to Brooklyn, I don't see it. Holiday to Brooklyn, I'd say almost no chance. I think whether it's directly or in a larger deal where there's players moving in different directions here, but we'll start with directly just to keep it simpler. One thing I took a look at today is the Celtics try to cut off some luxury tax hits and move closer to that second apron line. Feels like the more likely name to one of the more likely names to move on this roster is Sam Hauser. 4 years, about $11 million a year. Definitely a movable contract. Can move into mid-level space around the league. Trade exceptions. There's a couple teams with trade exceptions big enough to take him on. And good player. Defense has come a long way. Shooting 41% last year, marking the 4th straight year he's done that from 3. And he's 27. So it's been great in Boston. Real difference off their bench. But next year, he's going to cost them $80 million in luxury tax. So that moves into a Nets trade exception. It's only $10 million next year. So that's not a big slice out of their cap space there. And like I mentioned earlier in the show, it's a guy that they could move in a different direction potentially to bring back even more draft capital. Now, does that take a second going over to Brooklyn? Celtics don't have a ton of them. Does it cost any draft capital, given that maybe the Nets could actually have him be part of their future as a shooter, or move him down the line to a different team and bring back some draft capital for him? Just dumping him into Brooklyn's cap space works. And like I said, saves the Celtics $80 million in luxury tax outright. Is this something that you think could be realistic for Brooklyn?
Honestly, hadn't considered Hauser. I mean, listen. First off, I'm still staggered at $500 million in salary. These
And tax, yeah.
feasibly, that's staggering to me. He is a guy that, I mean, you're talking about a positive value guy. I mean, the contract is fine. And you're correct, he would fit, neatly in an exception. And he has value. You're right. I mean, he's either part of your future, or if he's not, he's a positive asset, certainly. That's something that's feasible. I could see that.
Do you think it would take a draft pick to take on money that low, or is that something where they would just take him on if they felt good about him being part of their team? Or
I think it would probably still require a little bit of equity. Yes, I do, because I think he is frankly in collecting mode at this point.
yeah,
I think that's where their head is right now.
yeah. So those are three things I kicked around here. There are other possibilities, certainly. I looked at some larger deals with Brooklyn, obviously, as a third team. Maybe
There is also the consideration that they may be consolidating some of their draft assets anyway. It would not shock me. Well, first off, I see no way that they're taking all 5 of these players.
Yep.
I don't see a world where that happens. I do see them consolidating and either punting a pick into next year or consolidating to move up. And I do think trying to move up is something that is foremost in their mind. They went into the lottery with the 6th seed and they fell to 8th. And I do think they are looking to either move up or more likely move up from the bottom of the first round, packaging players, and try to move up to a second lottery pick. But either way, I do see them consolidating picks. So backfilling and getting whatever light assets they could get in addition to Hauser, that's something that is feasible, I would suppose.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a million different scenarios here that could play out. I've done a couple 3-team trades with some offsetting salary going over to Brooklyn. I think everybody's looked at stuff like that again, given that they're the team with cap space here. I'll try to pull up one more here as an example. But again, if you're the Celtics in all of these deals, one of them that's been mentioned is Jrue Holiday to Dallas.
Right.
Holiday goes to Dallas. Washington, Gafford, those guys have to come back as matching salary there for Dallas. And that doesn't really save the Celtics a ton of money if they're taking back all of that salary themselves. Does PJ Washington go to Brooklyn? And that, to me, is a guy that the Nets could easily flip and make some additional draft capital off, or keep as part of their future. A younger forward who I thought had some great seasons in Dallas there since coming over from Charlotte, or Gafford, whichever of the two they would prefer there.
I see them flipping Gafford. If they did that, I could see them flipping Gafford, calling LA saying, hey.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And so, when I look at a Dallas trade, that comes to mind immediately. The Nets playing facilitator there to take on, of the 30 million coming back to Boston in that scenario, 15, not a big hit in Brooklyn's cap space. They can move on from some of that money too. Again, probably have to throw a second round pick their way to make it worth their while. But that's not a huge cost for moving off 32 million in my mind. And then in the Detroit scenario, I mentioned, if the Celtics are moving one of Holiday or Porzingis over to Detroit, I looked at a scenario where they could maybe move both and then flip Hauser over to Brooklyn. That's where things get a little convoluted there and probably unlikely. But, if they're trying to get below that second apron line, it's probably going to take something bold like that. So, do the Celtics take back Tobias Harris is expiring? Isaiah Stewart potentially in that scenario. In that spot, do you actually move off a first round pick if you're Boston to have Brooklyn take on some salary in that scenario, because you're getting a player that could be part of your future back like Stewart? Possibility, but things I think could get really complicated here with 3, 4, 5 teams involved. I think we already saw it with some of the trade deadline deals that came together where they started as 2 teams talking, and then a couple different deals got looped together to make the money work, and then you just saw some of these crazy deals in the end. Here's my crazy deal. Brooklyn eats about 20 million in this trade here.
Hauser.
Celtics save 30. Just some expiring money going back to Brooklyn. And
sure.
Like I
Which
said
they're
here,
fine with. I think in their perfect world, you're taking on short-term money and just punting your space in the next
for
summer.
the following year. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's their perfect world. And they're I think, as I said, I think they're comfortable with complicated. I don't think that's an issue for them. As long as they get what they're looking for.
You gotta be. You gotta be, because I think, it used to be when I was fooling around with the trade machine in past years, it'd be like, all right, forget about the 3-4 team deals. That stuff's not happening. Now, that's
I
probably
think a
what's
lot of
happening.
there'll be several 3. That's going to be the norm. People are
Yeah,
going to be
so it makes
surprised
it.
when you look and you see a straight, clean deal.
Yeah, so it makes it more complicated to guess what's going to happen here. And, again, I think you can glean at some stuff that's possible. And maybe it won't look exactly how you forecast it, but that Dallas one to me, I think, is something to watch with Brooklyn playing facilitator, especially since that's one to me that could happen leading up to the draft. Mavericks trying to figure out what their point guard situation is going to be. That one's a little tricky because the Mavs are up against the second apron a little bit, bringing Holiday in. So maybe they have to move more stuff to Brooklyn in that deal themselves. Caleb Martin, who again, that's not 1 year money. That's like 3-year money there.
Now we're talking a different thing.
Yeah. So I think that's where things get dicey for Brooklyn and talks like that. So that's going to be a hurdle in some of these talks. But I think that's one that's been reported. I think that's one on the Holiday front that's probably more likely than some others for Boston here. But Brooklyn's going to have to play facilitator. Thanks to Brian for stopping by here, giving us a little insight on what they're thinking leading up to the draft here. And, if you did have to look at, their draft pick here, and what is it, number 6, number 7?
They currently have 8, 9,
8.
26, 27, and 36. I
So
do not see a world where they do all 5 of those.
Yeah.
Where they actually select all 5 of those. As I say, I wouldn't surprise me if you're punting into a 1 pick into next year, because they only have 1 first rounder next year, and next year's draft is loaded as well. And I do know that they have interest in moving up.
Yep.
Again, when you're coming out of the combine and everybody's talking about moving up, the assumption was that meant moving up from 8 and trying to get whatever, 3, 6, etc. But from what I understand, it's more likely moving up from the bottom of the first round. And when I say bottom, I'm saying like 19.
Yep.
So 19 and 26 to move up, or 19 and say Cam Johnson to move up, and trying to get somewhere in the bottom of the lottery. Whether that's with, Toronto at 9 or Houston at 10. And oddly enough, both of those teams are big game hunting right now. So neither of those picks may end up being in play. They may be spoken for elsewhere. But if they are in play, those sort of aim.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting over the next 2 weeks here leading up to the draft, because it feels like there could be a lot of movement. There could be definitely some trades happening around the league unrelated to the draft, and definitely a lot of teams with big draft pieces. San Antonio moving up to number 2, Philly, and not a lot of buzz around them that I've heard so far, but they're in a weird spot with that number 3 pick. And then, as you mentioned, Brooklyn. Hard to imagine them not doing something with all the picks and cap space that they have right now. So, that trade up rumors floating around, could that involve Houston, Toronto, some of those teams in that top 10 area right there. Of course, Nets are already at 8. So we'll see what happens there. Again, appreciate Brian. Check out his piece in the New York Post today, and check out our YouTube channel, CLNS Media Celtics All Access. Subscribe over there for when we go live. Believe we're planning a Wednesday night show after the finals, game 3. As I mentioned earlier, go get that free Jalen Williams square, and check out Prizepicks. Again, code CLNS, $5 gets you $50 in bonus over there. And again, all our other YouTube channels as well. Go support them. NBA History Channel. You got Patriots Press Pass mini camp going on right now. So we have all the coverage over there. Bruins Rinkside, new coach for the Bruins right now. So a lot of coverage on that end. And then, of course, again, CLNS Media and Celtics All Access for all your Celtics coverage as the NBA draft and offseason rapidly approaches here. And that's it for us here on this midweek edition of the Garn Report. Thanks again to Brian Lewis stopping by for the first time. And hopefully we'll talk to you again here soon if a deal ends up happening between these two.
Oh, hopefully. Thanks for having me.
No one's sneaking a vegan brownie by me, I'll tell you that.
Okay, you know what, John? We're going to do it.
You have to feel that way too, Bobby.
I have to feel that way. Let's
Yeah.
fly out over and make Luke your first center.
Bobby, we gave you Luke an hour early. We're not going to end this on a damn conversation about Luke